Before we go much farther, I would like to introduce you to one of the main characters in the book, and that is Forest Park, which is the 5,000-acre park I described to you earlier on. It's sort of a wild area in the middle of Portland. 5,000 acres, 80 miles of meandering trails. But there are no, baseball diamonds or really any sort of developed parts of this park. It is, for the most part, fairly wild. And that's the view from Portland, from St. John's, where the book actually takes place. So you can see it's kind of this imposing wall of trees, which is kind of a weird juxtaposition to the metropolitan area of Portland. And that's the aerial view, so you get a sense that it does really feel like it's just kind of a forgotten place. But before we get any farther, we'll go back to the beginning. Carson, would you like to?
Okay, so Colin and I have known each other for a long time. We're married. I don't know if you guys caught that. But we went to college together in Missoula at the University of Montana, where we were friends and roommates in a big house full of people. And Colin had a band then called Tarkio, and we collaborated a little bit on some things, like this flyer you see behind me. Oh! Like this. Like this flyer that you see behind me. So that was kind of an early collaboration, and after we graduated from college in Montana, Colin stayed for a little and then moved to Portland. I went to San Francisco for a couple years, and then made my way up to Portland, and we were reunited. Where we lived in a big warehouse with a lot of people, a lot of artists. This is back when we were young and sexy.
That's a sexy, wacky noodle life.
It's as sexy as they come, Colin. So, this is a neat place that we live. It was called the Oak Street Building. I can say that now because we don't live there anymore, though it was illegal for us to live there. It was not zoned for residential living, so everybody who lived there was sort of skirting the law in order to pay cheap rent to have big studio spaces. There were lots of musicians that lived there, and also writers and artists and even a playwright. And we kind of set to work pretty quickly collaborating on new things. Colin's band, the Decemberists, was starting up just about the time I moved up there. This would have been about 10 years ago when I moved to Portland and when the Decemberists started up in 2001. This was an early flyer for them, maybe the first Decemberist flyer, I'm not sure. So that was happening. And then at the same time, Colin was working in a pizza place. I was attending bar. We very much had day jobs. But then we had this other thing that we really liked to do in our spare time.
Well, yeah, I mean, sort of the spirit of the collaboration in the Young Street building was pretty pervasive, and everybody was kind of always working together. And Carson, when she wasn't designing the flyers for the band, I would go hang out in her studio and look over her shoulder as she painted and tell her what to paint. And I thought if I could get a job just hanging out with painters and coming up with, like, being an idea man for painters.
It's called art direction.
Yeah.
So already have a job.
So there was just kind of like this kind of ongoing desire to collaborate, and we felt like we had similar fascinations and obsessions, and so we started working on a story. We felt like that was the true use of both of our talents for collaborations, work on a long-form story. So we started working on it, and it was going to be called How Ruthie Ended the War, and this is one of the illustrations from it. We got about 80 pages into it. We would work on it on our nights off in the warehouse, and I was writing, and she would do the sketching, and it was basically about a girl who lives in kind of vaguely Russia, and in this chateau with her father, Monsieur Baum. He was a tea merchant. And one night, a soldier appears, a mysterious soldier comes in telling a story about a ship frozen and locked in ice, where there's a mysterious cog on the ship, and Ruthie's listening at the door, and she gets caught by her father and gets sent to the gun shed, this is the gun shed. So these are all the original illustrations from that story. And when she wakes up the next morning in the gun shed, manages to get herself out, her whole family is gone. Everyone's disappeared. So she goes on a quest to find her father, which leads her to all sorts of adventures. And this is one of the first adventures. She comes to a bunch of drunken soldiers on a tank. And the soldiers take her in, I think, ply her with a drink, and then she wakes up, sold to an orphanage, and somehow gets kicked out of the orphanage, and ends up going, I think she meets up with a pirate then? So she gets sent on a pirate ship. She falls in love with a pirate. The pirate wants to be a baker, though. He's constantly invited to be a baker. So they follow her to this bakery. She gets pregnant. She's 13 years old when she gets pregnant. And then the baker, something happens to the pirate turned baker, and she falls in with some anarchists that escapes to the woods, and then has the baby, but the baby's a rabbit for some reason. And so this is what, listen, people with too much time on their hands. And it was great, but it just was so sprawling and just out of control and clearly not appropriate for children.
Sorry to the children who are here.
Don't do that. So we kind of abandoned it because we were kind of running out of thread, and also other things started kind of taking over our lives, and the band that I was in, the Decemberists, started getting a little bit more work and a little bit more attention. And did you want to talk about this?
No, I think you were going to talk about it.
Oh, right. Well, this is the first record. This is Castaways Cutouts. Carson did the art for this. And then she also did the cover. I mean, she's done the cover for all of them, but this is another one. Record covers all together. But also she managed to get an agent in this time, and then went on to do the Mysterious Adventures. Not only the cover, but the interior illustration, I should say. And then, with Lemony Snicket, as she was dead. And the award-winning Dillweed's Revenge, for which she did win the Society of Illustrators Silver Prize, Silver Medal. So that's what was happening with Carson.
So I was busy doing that stuff. Colin was busy being kind of totally amazing and, flying through the air with guitars and singing. The Decemberists went from a very small band with a very small following to a bigger band, and they did more and more traveling. They met the president. Had a #1 record. Woo!
We continued to collaborate all along, and Carson continued to do T-shirts and the website and posters, and then we also collaborated on
But all this to say, we were very busy with other things, and that story just sort of fell by the wayside. There was just no room for it in our lives for so many years. And then we had this little window in our schedules
And we were taking weekly walks in Forest Park all during this time when I was home and whenever we had an opportunity. And I think we'd always both been taken by the sort of the majesty of the woods, and also the sort of the archetypal, the woods that you recognize from folklore, folktale, even folk song, and it kind of made its way into Decemberist songs as well. And that had always kind of captured our imagination, and I think one day walking in Forest Park, it struck me that such a wild place, it feels so weird that it's like right on the boundary of Portland. You can walk over its boundary and feel like you're in an entirely different world. Why shouldn't it be its own world? And so that's where we kind of got the idea to create the world of Wildwood. But before we could really, craft a story, we felt like, where do we begin? How do we start? And it struck us that in order to explore a newfound country, an imagined country, we should start as any explorer should, and we should start with a map. So this is sort of based on our love of math-heavy books when we were kids. And we drew inspiration. We looked at a lot of maps of imaginary places, and we looked at that was from Wind in the Willows. This is clearly Narnia. And then, of course, you've got Middle-earth there. And then also, last but not least, so that's Zan. And that was a book series that I was really fond of as a kid. I read them, all of them within the span of a couple of years. And it always loved that it was so clearly Florida. Such a piece of the author's imagination, and why couldn't we do something like that with Forest Park? So, do you want to take over?
So this is Forest Park, a map of Forest Park. And it seemed like before there were characters in this book, in Wildwood, before there was a plot, before we had any idea, or Colin had any idea what was going to happen in this story, we decided to just make a map. So we took this map of Forest Park, and we drew out the boundary of it, and we made this map. It's a very collaborative map. We both drawn all over it. It's really hard to see. But we started with this map, and we put everything on it, every real landmark on it that we thought would make for a good story. There's a tavern in it called the Skyline Tavern. That's just this weird old tavern built in the 30s at the very top of this ridge, at the top of Forest Park. It always seems kind of strange that it's there. Kiddick Mansion, which is a real place, a real old mansion built in the 19th century, is on there. That dark road through the middle of it is not a real road, but it's sort of based on a road called East Erickson, which is a wide dirt road that winds through almost the whole length of the park. But you can't really drive on it. It was originally built because they wanted to develop the park residentially, but it was too prone to mudslides and stuff. So now it's just this road that's sort of winding through 11 miles of the park or something. There's lots of stuff on there that didn't make it into the story, like Chinatown. We have an interesting Chinatown in Portland. And, did you want to say anything?
Well, yeah, I just think that this is like a really true way of collaborating, being able to sit down and map together and kind of pick out the spots that had attracted our imagination and put them in there before a story was even there. And then we kind of winnowed some things out and built, and Carson drew a colored version that was a little bit more clear. There's the Audubon Society is where the avian principality is, for example.
Actually, see on the old map that originally it was called the bird barony, and then it's like crossed out and it says avian principality.
And the zoo, which is in the south, was the prison, of course. And so once we'd established the world, at least in that way, and as being people, both of us, I think, as kids, had drawn maps, and sometimes you draw a map, you don't even have to write a story. There's enough there. there's enough narrative power in maps alone you could sit for hours and kind of derive some sort of story. But this is when we started kind of building the plot and the characters that would become part of Wildwood. And we knew that, so we have this impassable wilderness, we have this forbidden forest, there's got to be something that will bring somebody, our child protagonist, into the woods. And we've been doing a lot of reading about Irish folktale, trying to get out some ideas, and there is actually a kind of an evil fairy called the Sluagh, which sometimes came in the form of crows, and was known to steal souls, but also steal babies from houses. And that seemed awesome and grim and weird. And so we thought, okay, well, that's a good place to start is an abduction by crows, a baby's abduction. But, you know, it made sense then that the protagonist, Prue, would be his minder, and would have to chase after him. And there's something about, there's sort of, well, I think of Prue as being kind of a primal maternal force, going after her brother, and there's a nice precedent in the great Sendak book, Outside Over There, in which the protagonist's baby brother is abducted by goblins, and she has to go in outside over there to get him back. And so that was sort of the beginning. There's Mac being taken away by crows, and Prue forced to go in after him. But because of Prue's journey being a fairly linear one, I think, like I said, I feel like she's sort of a primal force going in and going out, and that's kind of her personality. Felt like we needed another character to kind of round it out and also give an opportunity to sort of be a tour guide to another part of the woods. So her school friend Curtis comes along for the ride. So we have our protagonist, and we have our world, but we still needed to establish the rules. And you know, no matter how fantastic a country or imagined place, there's always rules. You know, you need to kind of create parameters. And so that was one of the hardest parts as we were collaborating, talking about the story. We were going on walks in the woods, talking about the story. And we kind of decided in fantasy, there's a sort of a parameter or a spectrum of realism that goes from stuff like, well, here, the Phantom Tollbooth on one end of total absurdism and irreverence, to Tolkien on the other end, where there's so much realism. There's, you know, species and histories of loyalties and deceit, and also entire languages designed. And I think we wanted to try to strike it somewhere in the middle, and we decided that the rules of Wind in the Willows served our purposes the best, especially using anthropomorphic animals, talking animals, which is a tricky thing, you know, when you think about it. Trying to get that in there, making it feel compelling and yet not too precious. But I do think that Wind in the Willows strikes that balance. And so a lot of talk about, well, so what do you do? You know, we'll talk about the coyotes and whether or not they would be, you know, a special breed of coyote with an opposable thumb, you know, that was able to hold a sword, or, you know what, the coyotes can just hold swords, okay? And so that was, and we were taking a lot of heart from Wind in the Willows, in particular because, you know, well, there's a rat in a boat, and with some oars, and, you know, there's a toad that can drive an automobile. As well as there's a way that, you know, it's never quite, you know, you're never quite sure what the relationship of these animals are with the human world that surrounds them. Sometimes you think that they're working, you know, the humans know that they're speaking animals around them, and sometimes you're not sure, they're trying to stay secret. So there's something that's kind of vague about that.
Wishy-washy.
With a little wishy-washy, which is funny and makes sense, and I think that was what we were going to try to strive for. And similarly, you know, talking about technology And technology and what sort of technology would exist in this world, we decided that we would just decide which pieces of technology existed and what was the coolest era in which they existed, and then that's what they would be. So, for example, you would have automobiles and square-rigged ships as well. And this is an awesome photo that Carson found while she was looking online for source photos.
Yeah, this is a real photo. It's a square-rigged ship sailing to Portland in the 50s or something. But there was something so fantastical about it. I was like, that's the world we want to create in Wildwood. The world where you get to pick the absolute best thing from every period of time throughout history and put it in a book.
And it just accepted that those things would exist together. But back to the coyotes. I think Carson can talk more about that.
We talked a lot about, Colin and I did, when we were just kind of like figuring out how the book would work, about anthropomorphized animals. A thing very close to my heart. I do love talking animals. But there's such a spectrum there. Like you have this illustration, for example, which was really more of I was sort of testing out different mediums and trying to decide what I wanted the book to look like. And I think that this was when I was thinking I might want the illustrations to look kind of like Pauline Baines' illustrations for Narnia and having them just be kind of classic line drawing illustrations. But this was an early idea for what the coyote soldiers would look like, and it's really just like a dog that someone dressed up in armor holding a sword. It doesn't feel much different than that, you know. It's like when people put sweatshirts on their dogs. And it didn't feel quite right. It just didn't feel like human enough. On the other end of the spectrum, there's S, which is like a furry human with a dog head, and also a different medium. Again, I was sort of playing around with what the right tone and the right medium for the book.
But at this point, this is when Carson came to me and I was writing downstairs. We have studio space. We turned our garage into studios. I have the downstairs, she has the upstairs. And she came down to me and basically told me that she didn't want to put the coyotes in armor anymore. And I had already written these whole sections that had all these coyotes in medieval armor, so we had to sit down about it.
I thought it was too D&D.
She thought it was too. And this is something that we discovered also as we were writing this. There's something called the Dungeons and Dragons envelope. And it was something that, for the kind of book that we wanted to write, and there's nothing against Dungeons and Dragons. There might be some Dragon Con people here, so it's cool. I mean, just for this style of book, we wanted to skirt the edge of that, not go all full D&D. And already with the medieval armor on the coyotes, it was starting to feel that way. So we had kind of a tete-a-tete. And decided it would be funnier if they were wearing Napoleonic-era uniforms. And so that's what we were doing, and we felt like that was kind of weirder and irreverent, and going back to the best era of technology, maybe that was the best era of military outfits.
I'm kind of really super into medieval armor, actually, but just for some reason the combination of it with the coyotes, I wasn't feeling it.
Yeah. So that brings us into collaboration. And you get a sense of what happens when two people, especially married people, collaborating. You want to?
Daggers and bloody hearts. So I'll start by saying that I've wanted to do this since I was a little kid, to illustrate kids' books. And I think I always imagined that the collaborative process between authors and illustrators of books for kids, that it would be more collaborative. And I think at one point it might have been. This thing that we're looking at, does anybody recognize it? I think it's from UBB and LBU, or Oldest today, but I think the former. Written by Ruth Krauss and illustrated by Maureen Sendak. This is a really collaborative book. It was one of Maureen Sendak's first books he illustrated, and I'm pretty sure, I've heard different stories about it, but I'm pretty sure they basically kind of sat down at a table together, and he helped edit her manuscript. which was kind of, the whole manuscript is sort of a collection of observations by children